The shuttle bay doors of the station groaned open with a reluctant shudder, as if the very structure itself was hesitant to admit another soul into its haunted confines. Commander Atlas Vale, the sole occupant of the approaching shuttle, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold vacuum of space. The station, a monolith against the starlit backdrop of the galaxy, appeared as a beacon of salvation to the untrained eye. But Vale knew better. Salvation was a luxury not afforded in the vast expanse of space, especially not in places touched by the shadow of death. As the shuttle docked, the absence of the customary greeting committee of medical personnel and security was the first sign that something was amiss. Vale had expected as much, yet the silence that enveloped him as he disembarked was unsettling. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes, heavy with the weight of unsaid words and uncried screams. The docking area was in disarray, evidence of a hurried evacuation, or perhaps a struggle. Personal belongings were scattered amidst technical equipment, a child's toy lying forlornly next to a datapad, blinking with unread notifications. Vale's footsteps echoed ominously as he moved forward, his senses on high alert. The station's emergency lighting cast long shadows, giving the impression of movement in the corner of his eye. More than once he whirled around only to find the emptiness mocking him. "Welcome to the party," Vale muttered to himself. The station's internal systems were operational but unresponsive to his attempts to access logs or communication channels. It was as if the station itself had been placed on mute, a silent witness to the horrors it housed. Vale's exploration led him to the command center, the heart of the station. The doors slid open with a hiss, revealing a scene of chaos frozen in time. Screens flickered with static, while others displayed the last desperate messages sent from the station. A hastily abandoned game of cards lay on a table. The players vanished as if plucked away by an invisible hand. It was here, among the remnants of daily life abruptly ceased, that Vale found the station's log. The entries began routinely enough, with reports of arrivals and departures, supply inventories, and maintenance schedules. But as he scrolled through the entries, a sense of foreboding grew. Mentions of a quarantine breach, a containment failure, and then, increasingly frantic notes about an unknown pathogen. The last entry was a stark warning. "Do not come for us, it's too late." As Vale absorbed the words, a sound pierced the silence, a soft, almost imperceptible whimper. His hand instinctively went to the blaster at his side as he turned towards the source. In the shadows of the command center, barely discernible was the huddled form of a person. Or at least what once was a person. The figure was partially obscured by darkness, but even from a distance, Vale could see the unnatural angles of its limbs, the jerky, sporadic movements that spoke of something wholly unnatural. "Damn it," Vale breathed, the realization dawning on him. The virus had beaten him here, its effects all too evident in the twisted form before him. This station was not a refuge, but another tomb, much like the Requiem had become. Steeling himself, Vale approached, his blaster aimed at the figure. Survival instincts, honed over years of command, kicked in, but so did the remnants of his humanity. "I'm sorry," he whispered, not sure if the apology was for the creature or himself. The figure lunged with a suddenness that belied its previous stillness, a distorted parody of human movement. Vale's response was automatic, the blaster's discharge a brief flare in the dimness, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. As the figure crumpled, the silence returned, oppressive and complete. Vale stood alone amidst the echoes of his actions, a solitary figure against the darkness. Vale moved deeper into the station, the silence his constant companion, punctuated only by the occasional crackle of static from the communication panels. The logs had given him a breadcrumb trail to follow, a narrative of disaster that had unfolded in much the same way as it had on the Requiem. His footsteps echoed in the empty corridors, a stark reminder of his isolation. The research labs were his next destination, a place where answers lay buried under layers of horror. The door slid open with a reluctant groan, revealing a chamber of nightmares. Tables strewn with scattered papers, vials of unknown substances, and, Most disturbingly, the containment units, or what remained of them. Glass shattered, the remnants stained with something dark and viscous. Vale's gaze fell upon a series of journals, left haphazardly on a workstation. The handwriting started precise and scientific, only to devolve into scribbles of madness. He flipped through the pages, piecing together the story of the virus's arrival on the station. A survivor from the Requiem, not known to be infected, had been brought in for treatment. It had been a Trojan horse, the virus biding its time before striking. As he read, Vale couldn't help but scoff. Should have known better, he muttered, the irony of his own situation not lost on him. The station's scientists had been as eager as those on the Requiem to study the unknown, with catastrophic results. The sound of something scraping against the floor snapped Vale's attention to the present. He wasn't alone. From the shadows between the broken containment units, a figure emerged, its form grotesque, a testament to the virus's ability to warp and mutate the human body. The face was barely recognizable, features twisted, one eye enlarged and bulging grotesquely from its socket. Vale raised his blaster, the weight of the weapon both a comfort and a curse. "Guess we're doing this dance again," he said, a grim acceptance in his voice. The infected lunged, faster than its misshapen body suggested possible. Vale fired, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The creature stumbled but did not fall, its resilience a horror unto itself. With a grunt, Vale dodged to the side, avoiding a swipe of elongated claw-like fingers. He fired again, and this time, the creature went down, a heap of twisted limbs and oozing dark fluid. Breathing heavily, Vale surveyed the room. The aftermath of the encounter a stark reminder of the threat that lurked within the station. The virus was here, its presence an echo of the past, a shadow that followed him even as he sought to escape it. He collected the journals, stuffing them into his bag. They were evidence of the station's fate, and perhaps a clue to the virus's weakness. With a final glance at the lab, its secrets laid bare by violence and tragedy, Vale turned and left, the weight of his mission growing heavier with each step. The station's corridors stretched out before him, a labyrinth of darkness and silence. But Vale was no longer seeking escape. He was hunting, driven by a need to confront the nightmare head-on. The virus had taken everything from him, and he would not rest until he had returned the favor, until the silence was broken for good. The station's engineering deck was a maze of corridors and bulkheads, each turn bringing Vale closer to his objective, the heart of the station, where he hoped to find the means to enact his desperate plan. The air was thick with the stench of decay, a tangible reminder of the virus's pervasive reach. Vale's footsteps were muffled against the metal floor, the sound swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere that hung heavy around him. In the engineering control room, the glow of monitors cast a pallid light, illuminating the chaos that had taken over. Consoles were left active, screens displaying critical errors and system failures, a digital cacophony left unheeded. Vale approached the main console, his fingers dancing over the keys as he brought up the schematic of the station's energy core. If his plan was to have any chance of success, he needed to understand the intricacies of the system he was about to manipulate. As he studied the diagrams, the silence was broken by a static-filled crackle over the station's intercom. Vale tensed, half expecting the voice of another survivor. But what came through was far more unsettling, a guttural, inhuman sound that seemed to scrape against the very air. The virus, in its quest to consume and reshape, had found a way to breach the station's communication systems, its presence manifesting like it did back on his ship. Shaking off the unease, he focused on the task at hand. The energy core was housed deep within the station, a pulsing heart that powered every system and corridor. To reach it, he would have to navigate through areas now, likely teeming with the infected, a perilous journey through the bowels of the station. Preparation was key. Vale scavenged through the engineering deck, gathering tools and supplies that might aid him. Welding torches, power cells, even a rudimentary plasma cutter, anything that could be used as a weapon or a tool. His arsenal assembled, he set out, the weight of his equipment a constant reminder of the gravity of his mission. The journey was fraught with danger. Infected lurked in the shadows, their bodies grotesque parodies of their former selves. Each encounter was a battle for survival, Vale's blaster and makeshift weapons his only allies against the relentless tide of mutation. In one harrowing encounter, Vale was ambushed by a group of infected, their bodies twisted into horrific forms. Limbs elongated, skin mottled and torn, they were nightmares made flesh. Vale fought with desperate ferocity, his blaster cutting through them, each shot a beacon of defiance. The plasma cutter, wielded with grim determination, severed limbs and carved through the twisted flesh, a tool of salvation repurposed for slaughter. As the last of the attackers fell, Vale allowed himself a moment to catch his breath, the acrid smell of burnt flesh and ozone filling his nostrils. The corridor lay in ruins, the aftermath of the battle a testament to the virus's ability to corrupt and destroy. But there was no time for rest. The core awaited, and with it, the chance to end the nightmare. Vale pressed on, each step taking him deeper into the heart of darkness. The station seemed to pulse around him, a labyrinth of metal and shadow, its secrets laid bare by the virus's insidious touch. The engineering deck behind him, Vale descended into the lower levels of the station, the core's humming presence a siren call guiding him forward. The gathering storm was upon him, but he was not deterred. He was the eye of the tempest, calm and resolute amidst the chaos. Vale's descent into the lower levels of the station felt like a journey into the very bowels of hell. Each level down brought him closer to the energy core, the station's lifeline, now the centerpiece of his desperate plan. The corridors here were darker, the emergency lighting sparse and flickering, casting long, dancing shadows that played tricks on the eyes. In these depths, the virus's presence was overwhelming. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with a sinister life, covered in organic growths that throbbed in rhythm with some unseen heart. Vale pressed on, his resolve steeling him against the horror that surrounded him. He found his way to the research annex, a detour driven by the hope of finding something, anything, that could give him an edge. The annex was a graveyard of scientific ambition, the projects abandoned mid-operation, notes and datapads scattered in the wake of the outbreak. Vale sifted through the detritus, his search rewarded with a scientist's audio log, its contents a chilling account of the initial infection and the rapid descent into madness that followed. The voice, calm at first, broke into hysteria as it recounted the mutations, the body horror that ensued from the virus's insidious touch. Should have been gods, the voice crackled, a sob caught in its throat. Instead were butchers. The log ended in a cacophony of screams and static, a testament to the fate that had befallen the station's inhabitants. Vale pocketed the device, a grim reminder of the stakes. Pushing deeper into the annex, Vale stumbled upon a lab that seemed untouched by the chaos that gripped the rest of the station. Inside, vials of luminescent liquid were carefully arranged, the fruits of research into the virus. Notes scribbled in the margins of journals spoke of a potential weakness, a susceptibility to extreme temperatures. Armed with this new knowledge, Vale set about improvising a device capable of exploiting this weakness. The station's maintenance supplies provided the necessary components, a high-capacity coolant tank, tubing, and a regulator from a damaged environmental suit. The result was crude but functional, a makeshift weapon that, if the notes were to be believed, could turn the tide. With the device slung over his shoulder, Vale left the annex, the weight of his discovery a counterbalance to the dread that filled him. The path to the core was clearer now, marked by signs of struggle and desperation, the final stand of those who had tried to stem the tide of infection. As he neared the core, the infected became more numerous, drawn to the energy pulsing through the station's veins. Vale's first test of the coolant weapon was a desperate defense against a horde that ambushed him in a narrow service corridor. The device worked, the infected recoiling and shrieking as the freezing liquid hit them, their mutated flesh hardening and cracking under the extreme cold. But the victory was short-lived. The noise attracted more. The corridor soon filled with the twisted forms of the once human crew. Vale fought on, each blast of coolant a reprieve bought with ingenuity and determination. Emerging from the melee, battered but unbowed, Vale found himself at the entrance to the core chamber. The door stood ajar, the security protocols overridden in the chaos. He paused at the threshold, the hum of the chorus siren song calling him to his final challenge. Inside, the core pulsed with power, the heart of the station laid bare. Vale approached, the plan clear in his mind, but the outcome anything but. To turn the station's lifeblood into a weapon against the infection was a gamble, the consequences of failure unthinkable. But there was no turning back. Vale set to work, his actions a dance of desperation and hope, the makeshift coolant weapon his ace in the hole. The station's fate, and his own, hung in the balance, teetering on the edge of the abyss into which he had so willingly stepped. With the core's pulsating energy before him, Vale's thoughts raced, piecing together the final elements of his daring strategy. The core chamber, a cavernous space bathed in the eerie glow of the power source, hummed with a latent force that seemed almost sentient, aware of the intruder in its midst. Vale's presence was an anomaly in the otherwise meticulously ordered chaos of the station's failing systems. He set his makeshift coolant weapon aside, its purpose served for the moment, and approached the core's control panel. The interface was a complex array of dials, switches, and screens, a testament to human engineering and ambition. Vale's fingers hovered over the controls, the gravity of his next actions weighing heavily on him. To manipulate the core into creating a destructive pulse meant diving deep into the station's operational heart, rewriting protocols and overriding safety measures. As he worked, Vale couldn't help but reflect on the irony of his situation. Here he was, attempting to save what remained of the station and possibly himself, by risking everything on a plan that had as much chance of killing him as it did of succeeding. "If you could see me now," he murmured, the memory of his second-in-command, Mercer, flashing through his mind. Mercer, with his ever-practical advice, would have scoffed at the plan, and then, begrudgingly, helped to execute it. The silence of the core chamber was suddenly broken by the sound of the station's intercom crackling to life. Vale tensed, expecting the haunting, inhuman sounds of the infected. Instead, a voice, eerily calm and decidedly human, filled the space. "Do you really think you can stop it?" the voice taunted, its source unknown but its intent clear, to sow doubt. Vale shook off the distraction, focusing on the task at hand. He had managed to access the core's primary control matrix, his fingers flying over the console as he input the sequence of commands that would reroute the energy flow. The station's AI, dormant since the outbreak, flickered to life on the screen, its protocols confused by the unconventional commands. "Warning, energy reroute will result in critical overload," the AI intoned, its voice a stark reminder of the danger. "Thanks for the heads up," Vale shot back, a grim smile touching his lips as he bypassed the last of the AI's safeguards. The core began to whine, a high-pitched sound that grew in intensity as the energy built up, ready to be unleashed in a devastating pulse. The plan was simple in its audacity. Use the core's energy to send a pulse through the station, targeting the virus-infected cells with the specific frequency he discovered in the research annex. It was a shot in the dark, but if the logs were to be believed, it could disrupt the virus's cellular structure, effectively killing it. With the sequence initiated, Vale retreated from the console, his gaze locked on the core. The energy within it swirled, a maelstrom of power that thrummed with potential. The countdown began, the AI's voice counting down the seconds to activation. Vale braced himself, the outcome uncertain. Success meant the end of the nightmare that had consumed the station and the requiem before it. Failure was not an option he allowed himself to consider. As the countdown reached its final moment, Vale could only hope that his gamble would pay off. The chamber vibrated with the unleashed energy, a blinding light filling the space as the pulse was released. Vale shielded his eyes, the roar of the core's release drowning out all other sounds. And then, As quickly as it had begun, it was over, the light dimming and the sound fading into silence. The aftermath was a moment suspended in time, the core's glow stabilizing, the chamber still. Vale watched, his breath caught in his throat, waiting for a sign of success or the indication of his imminent demise. Vale found himself enveloped in a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight upon his shoulders. The chamber, lit now only by the subdued glow of the core, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the fallout of Vale's daring gambit. He remained motionless, a solitary figure amidst the technological marvel he had manipulated into a weapon of last resort. The silence, however, was short-lived. A low, guttural moaning filled the air, a harbinger of the infected's approach. Vale's heart sank as he realized the pulse had not been the clean solution he had hoped for. Instead of eradicating the virus, it seemed to have incited the infected into a frenzied state. They came at him in a surge, a tidal wave of twisted limbs and snarling faces, their humanity long since obliterated by the virus's relentless assault on their cells. Vale's response was automatic, the survival instincts that had carried him this far kicking into overdrive. He retrieved his makeshift coolant weapon, its tank nearly depleted but still functional. The narrow confines of the chamber worked both for and against him, funneling the infected into a choke point but leaving Vale with little room to maneuver. He unleashed the coolant in short, controlled bursts, the hissing sound of the liquid nitrogen meeting the air almost drowned out by the cacophony of the infected's rage. The first wave was stopped in its tracks, bodies freezing mid-assault, their flesh hardening and becoming brittle. Vale didn't wait to see the results. He moved swiftly, using the brief respite to find a more defensible position. Behind him, the frozen forms of the infected shattered as their comrades trampled over them, undeterred by the fate that had befallen their vanguard. Vale knew he couldn't hold them off indefinitely. The coolant was a temporary measure and his ammunition was dwindling. In a desperate bid to stem the tide, Vale turned to the environment. He fired at the overhead conduits, rupturing them and sending showers of sparks and electrical arcs cascading down upon the infected. Some fell, their bodies convulsing under the assault of high voltage, but still, they came. The chamber became a battleground, the air filled with the stench of burned flesh and the sharp tang of ozone. Vale fought with a ferocity born of desperation, each move calculated to maximize the efficiency of his dwindling resources. He was no longer just a survivor. He was the last line of defense against an onslaught that threatened to overwhelm him. As the last of the coolant was expended, Vale resorted to hand-to-hand combat, using the butt of his weapon to fend off the closest of the infected. Their numbers seemed endless, a never-ending stream of mutated bodies driven by the single-minded intent to consume and destroy. In the chaos, Vale suffered wounds, gashes and bites that marred his flesh, each a burning testament to the infected's relentless assault. Yet, he fought on, driven by a resolve that bordered on the fanatical. He could not, would not, allow himself to be overcome. The battle raged, a symphony of violence and survival instinct until, at last, the tide began to turn. Whether by virtue of the sheer number of bodies or the cumulative effect of the injuries he inflicted, the infected's numbers started to dwindle. Vale stood amidst the carnage, breathing heavily, his body a tapestry of wounds and bruises. The chamber around him was a ruin, the floor slick with the remnants of the battle. Yet for the moment, it was quiet once more. But Vale knew better than to take solace in the silence. The virus was still out there, lurking within the station's bowels, waiting for its next opportunity to strike. And he, the last man standing in this necropolis of steel and shadow, had no illusions about the nature of the war he was fighting. It was a war of attrition, one he was determined to see through to its bitter end, no matter the cost. In the aftermath of the battle, Vale's breaths came in heavy, ragged gasps, each inhale a painful reminder of the physical toll the fight had exacted. The core chamber, once a beacon of technological achievement, now resembled a scene from a nightmare bathed in the flickering light of damaged consoles and the eerie glow of the core itself, which continued to pulse with a subdued, almost mocking rhythm. Vale's injuries were numerous, yet it was the wounds unseen, those carved deep within his psyche, that weighed most heavily upon him. He had witnessed horrors that defied comprehension, fought battles that seemed ripped from the darkest recesses of imagination. And through it all, the voice that had taunted him over the intercom lingered, its words echoing in the silence that followed the carnage. "Do you really think you can stop it?" The question, meant to sow doubt, instead ignited a spark of defiance within Vale. He had come too far, lost too much to allow the specter of failure to take hold. With a grim determination, he set about the task of securing the core chamber, sealing the breaches through which the infected had poured with a combination of ingenuity and the remnants of the station's maintenance supplies. As he worked, the station's communication system crackled to life once more. Vale tensed, expecting another volley of psychological warfare. Instead, what he heard was a transmission of a different sort, a looped distress signal emanating from a nearby sector of the station. The message was fragmented, the voice distorted by static, but the underlying plea was unmistakable. "Is anyone, please, need help?" The decision to investigate was made with a resignation that felt like the closing of a circuit. Vale knew the risks, understood that the virus's reach was far from contained, but the possibility of another survivor, however remote, compelled him forward. He gathered what supplies he could carry, his makeshift weapons, and the remnants of the coolant device, and set out toward the source of the transmission. The corridors were a labyrinth of shadows and silence, the aftermath of the core's pulse and the subsequent battle visible in the scorch marks and debris that littered the path. Vale moved with a cautious speed, his senses attuned to any sign of movement, any hint of the infected lying in wait. As he neared the source of the transmission, the damage wrought by the virus became increasingly apparent. The walls were marred by grotesque growths, the air thick with a miasma that spoke of decay and corruption. And then, amidst the desolation, Vale found the source of the plea for help. The scene that greeted him was one of desperation, a group of survivors barricaded within a makeshift shelter, their faces gaunt, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. They were scientists, members of the station's research team, who had managed to evade the infection but found themselves trapped, their provisions dwindling, their hope fading with each passing day. Vale's arrival was met with a cautious relief, the survivors eyeing the weapons he carried warily, even as they welcomed the prospect of rescue. Among them was the source of the voice that had haunted the core chamber, a researcher who had pieced together the truth of the virus's origin. "It's not just a pathogen," the researcher explained, her voice tinged with a weariness that spoke of sleepless nights spent poring over data. "It's a herald, a precursor to something far greater, far more malevolent." The revelation was a chilling addition to the nightmare Vale had lived. The virus, it seemed, was but the first wave, an advance guard for an entity that sought to consume not just the station, but all of existence. The researcher spoke of ancient texts, of cosmic horrors that dwelled in the spaces between stars, their appetites insatiable, their powers beyond human comprehension. As Vale listened, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, the events aboard the Requiem and the station coalescing into a narrative of cosmic horror that defied belief. Yet, the evidence was undeniable, the threat all too real. The plan that had begun with the core's manipulation evolved in that moment, expanding to encompass not just the survival of those present, but the prevention of an apocalypse. Vale knew what he had to do, the path forward clear, if fraught with danger. With the survivors' knowledge and the remnants of the station's resources, Vale set about crafting a new strategy, one that would require all of his cunning, all of his courage. The battle was far from over, the war against the darkness just beginning. With the revelations from the survivors fueling his resolve, Vale set to work with a new sense of urgency. The entity that lay beyond the viral outbreak was not just a threat to the station, but to the very fabric of reality itself. The survivors, though weakened by their ordeal, rallied around Vale, their expertise in the station's systems and the virus providing invaluable insight into the battle that lay ahead. The plan was audacious, to use the station itself as a weapon against the approaching entity. The core, already manipulated by Vale to create a pulse against the virus, would be the centerpiece of this last stand. But first, they needed to secure more ground, to reclaim sections of the station that had been overrun by the infected. Armed with makeshift weapons and the remnants of the station's defense systems, Vale and the survivors moved out from their makeshift sanctuary, each corridor and chamber a potential battleground. The infected, drawn by their activity, attacked in waves, their numbers seemingly undiminished despite the losses they had suffered. Vale led the charge, his determination manifesting as a fierce prowess in combat. The survivors followed his lead, their desperation lending them a strength they had not known they possessed. Together, they fought through the hordes, reclaiming vital systems and fortifying their position within the station. Amidst the chaos of battle, moments of humanity shone through. A joke shared over the din of combat, a helping hand extended in the midst of a skirmish. These moments, fleeting though they were, served as reminders of what they were fighting for. Not just survival, but the preservation of their very humanity. As they neared the core once more, the entity made its presence known. The air itself seemed to warp, a palpable sense of dread enveloping them as they pressed on. The survivors, their faces set in grim determination, understood the stakes. This was not just a fight for their lives, but a battle against an apocalypse. The core chamber became their fortress, the heart of their final stand. Vale, utilizing every piece of knowledge and every resource they had gathered, prepared for the entity's assault. The survivors, each with their own role in the plan, stood ready, their resolve unbreakable. And then, with a cacophony that seemed to shake the very station, the entity arrived. It was unlike anything Vale or the survivors had ever witnessed, a maelstrom of darkness and malice that defied physical description. Its presence was an affront to reality, a nightmare made manifest. The battle that ensued was titanic, a clash of wills as much as weapons. Vale, at the forefront, became a beacon of resistance, his actions inspiring the survivors to fight with a ferocity that belied their exhaustion. They unleashed everything at their disposal, the core's energy harnessed into weapons of light and heat that lanced through the darkness. The entity, for all its power, found itself contested by this band of humans, their defiance a challenge it had not anticipated. The station trembled with the force of their confrontation, the outcome hanging in the balance. As the battle reached its zenith, Vale realized the truth of their struggle. It was not about defeating the entity outright. A being of such horror could not be so easily vanquished. Instead, their goal was to push it back. With a final desperate push, Vale and the survivors focused their efforts on the core, channeling its energy into a singular, blinding burst. The light that erupted from the core was a lance of pure defiance, cutting through the darkness through the entity itself. The station shook as if in the throes of death, the energy backlash from the core's discharge a maelstrom that threatened to tear everything apart. But amidst the chaos, there was a moment of piercing clarity, a sense that, against all odds, they had succeeded. The darkness receded, the entity withdrawing, its presence diminishing until all that was left was the station, battered and scarred, but still intact. The survivors, though weary beyond measure, allowed themselves a moment of cautious relief. They had held the line, pushed back against the darkness with the light of their determination and courage. But Vale knew the truth of their victory was more complex. They had not destroyed the entity, merely delayed its advance. The breach was sealed for now, but the cost had been high, and the war, he feared, was far from over. As they regrouped in the core chamber, their eyes turned to the stars beyond the station's battered hull. Vale understood that their struggle was but a chapter in a larger saga. The entity, and others like it, lurked in the void, waiting for their moment to breach the realms of humanity once more. For now, though, they had won a respite, a chance to heal, and to prepare for the battles that lay ahead. Vale, standing amid the survivors, his gaze fixed on the void, felt a weight settle upon him, the weight of leadership, of responsibility. He had led them through the darkness, and he would lead them through whatever came next.